just that very vividly as a young man. And you know, people can't read your mind. People, if I tell people that I'm a Christian, that doesn't prove a whole lot to them because they can't read my mind and know what I'm thinking in my mind. But they can observe me, and they can know by what I do as to whether or not that my living like a Christian is something that would convict me, if you would, of being a Christian. I want to ask you a question as you're turning in your Bibles to the first chapter of 1 Peter. I want to ask you this question. As people observe you, would they reach the conclusion that you're a Christian? If at your work, if it's not known, if you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, and just thinking about your life, is there enough evidence that as people think about that would convict you? I want to read a passage or a set of verses in 1 Peter 1 that I think addresses that to some degree. And then we're going to look at some other things in a moment from the book of Ephesians that help us as we think about that question tonight. Verse 13 of 1 Peter 1 says this, "Therefore gird up the loins of your mind and be sober and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lust, as in your ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. Because it is written, be holy, for I am holy." There are a lot of things in those verses that I think can help us as we think about the question that I have asked. But in my past, as I have considered those verses, both as someone who was hoping to preach about it and trying to prepare a lesson about it, and just thinking about it personally and about how that affects my life, I think about four words in those verses. There are four words that kind of make me think, okay, this is more than just me trying to do a few things that would express the fact that I'm a Christian. What Peter says to these brethren who are living in a Greco-Roman society where they're faced with different things that people do in a world that's really anti-God, he says to them that you need to be holy in all your behavior. I want you to somehow focus your attention for a moment tonight on those four words, in all your behavior. And I want you to think about how important it is for you to live a life that is inclined toward holiness as opposed to a life that is inclined toward profanity and those things that are profane. And I want you to think about it from this perspective. Every single thing you do, God is concerned about. The thing that affects me with all of these words is this. You know, on the Lord's Day, when I'm gathered with you, I don't know that it's as difficult to be holy as it is the other 6 days of the week. This is a pretty easy place to be holy, even if it's in appearance only. If my heart is not right, yet in this environment, most of the time, I could convince you, as you could convince me, that I'm a holy person, because there's not much in this assembly to get in trouble with. I suppose it's possible, but I don't observe you doing things that I would consider profane, certainly, or immoral, or anything that would make me question the kind of person you are. But I may see you, or you may see me out in the midst of our fine community at places that I would think, well, that's not really where a Christian should be going. Or doing in those places possibly things that I might think that's not what a Christian should be doing. And so when I think about that, or when you think about that in reference to me, we're saying about each other, those aren't the kind of things that a Christian should be involved with. And we make judgments about that, because we all understand that God expects certain behavior of us. God asked me to be holy, and He asked me to be holy in every facet of my life. And I'm just going to tell you, that's the challenge for us. Being holy in this assembly is not hard. As a matter of fact, this is easy. Thinking about holy things and living in a holy way and doing holy things is easy in this environment. But I will tell you right now, if you're a college student, you get around a group of people who are involved in a certain activity, or who want to be involved, and who may ask you to be involved, and who invite you to be involved. I'm going to tell you what, you want to find out what kind of person you are in terms of your holiness before God? You evaluate how you operate in those circumstances. Don't evaluate yourself here. This is the easy part. You evaluate yourself there. And those of us who may be involved in work and other areas, you evaluate yourself in that environment. How is it that you live your life in those kind of circumstances? This is the easy part. And I'm going to suggest to all of us tonight that God is just as concerned, if not more so, that we live our lives in a holy and not a profane manner, that we do, as he says here in verse 13, that we do gird up the loins of our mind, that we are sober, that we rest our hope fully, and then we pay attention to the fact that we should live holy lives. I think this whole idea of holiness sometimes maybe just gets pushed to the side a little bit, or at least it's not given the attention it needs to be, because we think that this is a facet of my life that I need to be holy in, but in another area of my life, I don't have to be as holy. And there's nothing more foreign to the truth than that. I mean, what he says here, what Peter says is, everything you do needs to revolve around the fact that you live a holy life. So I'm going to tell you something. God is just as concerned that you understand the truth in reference to what it means for you to be saved and what he says. He's just as concerned about how you treat your neighbor as he is that. Now, the implications of that may not always be the same, and what that may mean may not always be the same. But if he wants you in all your behavior to be holy, isn't he concerned about that? Isn't he concerned about when you drive down the road and somebody darts out in front of you, or somebody's tailgating you or whatever, you keep yourself under control? I will tell you. But that's exactly what that passage says to me. This passage tells me that he is equally concerned about if I preach the truth, he's equally concerned that I treat Beth the way I ought to treat her. He's equally concerned about that, because it's not just in one area of my life, it's in everything that I do. And the problem for most of us is we got this down. We got this down pretty well. It's out there that we don't have down. Or maybe it's out there that we're trying to be something that we really aren't. So I want to offer some things tonight as we think about this, just a few points in reference to us thinking about how it is that we live. Not just what we think, but how we live, because that's what people see. I want to ask you some questions about that. The book of Ephesians is filled. I love the book because it's filled with admonitions that have to do with how we live our lives. And so I want you to turn there and be looking at a few things with me. This is in chapter 4 and verse 1, where Paul would say, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you were called. There is something in a Christian's life that has changed. And I will just tell you that if you're a Christian and no one can tell the difference in you before and after you became a Christian, there's a problem there. There's a problem. Because what he says in chapter 2 is this. He says, and you he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sins. Now, there's a relationship issue. You were dead and now you've been made alive. So I get that. But he goes on to say in verse 2, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others. Now that's the before picture. That's what we were before. And then he says in verse 4, he says, but a change took place, and this change was evident because, verse 4, but God, who is rich in mercy because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses, he made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and he raised us up together and made us sit together in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. Well, what he says in chapter 4 and verse 1 is just amplified, I think, in chapter 2. Because he's saying, you were dead, and now you've been made alive. And now he says in verse 1 of chapter 4, as he gets to the section of the book and the letter that says, not only do you have the relationship, but now I want you to sustain the responsibility. If you're going to be a Christian, then walk like a Christian. And folks, that's the challenging part. But becoming a Christian, while it may take some conviction, it may take some courage, it may take the fact that you may have to turn against a parent or turn against someone who loves you. While all that is critically important, and I realize that may be hard for some to do. But the hard part is not becoming a Christian. The hard part is living as a Christian. That's the difficulty. And that's what Paul is addressing here. He said, if you're going to walk, he said, I beseech you, I beg you to walk worthy of the calling. So many people want to become Christians, but then they don't want to assume the responsibility that comes with that. And I think that affects us all. I don't think anybody's immune to that. So the application of these points that Paul makes, I think, are different with each of us, but they're all affected because of the same thing, because it's hard to live as a Christian. And this change, this again is in chapter 4 of Ephesians, this change begins first by what you think and how you think. So I want you to look at verse 17. I love these verses because it explains in this letter, like Paul does in Colossians and other companion letters, it explains this difference. In verse 17 says, "This I say therefore, and testify in the Lord that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, and who being past feeling have given themselves over to lewdness to work all uncleanness with greediness." I'm going to stop before I read on, but I just want to say this. This is where a lot of people are today. They're just past feeling. I mean, they live in however they want to live, they live and they accomplish everything they want to accomplish sensually, which is really what he's saying. That they live, or they're past feeling. And what they do is they address things like lewdness and uncleanness and greediness. They address those things. You know why people do those things? Because it's fun. I'm going to tell you what, if you want to address yourselves sensually, and more specifically even sexually, I'll tell you what, that's easy to do. Because those things are fun. There is pleasure in doing those things. But when you have no feeling about that, when it doesn't affect you as God intends, you'll do that. That's what's wrong with most of the world. That's why sleeping with anyone and watching anything and listening to anything and engaging yourself in things that create pleasurable times and pleasurable moments, that's why most people, they do whatever they want to do, because it doesn't affect them anymore. And Paul says that's what an old man does. Not an old man chronologically necessarily, but an old man who is living the way he says as these Gentiles live. In the futility of their mind, that's what he says. They're not thinking right. That's where all that starts. And I'm going to tell you tonight, if you're engaged in activities that you have no business being engaged in, the number one problem is you're not thinking right. You're acting the way you want to act, but it's because you're not thinking right. And Paul is going to tell them that, because in verse 20 he says, "But you have not so learned Christ. If indeed you have heard him and you've been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus, that you put off concerning your former conduct the old man which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lust." That's why you do what you do. It's deceitful lust. It's still lust. It's still something you desire. It's still something that's pleasurable, but it's deceitful. It's telling you one thing, and ultimately it's offering you something different. And then verse 23, I think, is the wonderful key. You need to be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Because I'm going to tell you something about that. The lust and the lewdness and the pleasure that comes with those things, that's not going to change, folks. You're not going to wake up one day and say, "Oh, I don't have any of those desires anymore." That's not going to happen to you. You're always going to have those desires, hopefully. Those are good things used in the right kind of way and under the right circumstances. But what Paul says is, you need to be renewed in the spirit of your mind. You need to be able to control those things in your mind so that they don't affect you in this kind of way. You need to have some feeling about that. You need to have some decisions about that. You need to be people who give some thought to that. Because he says in verse 20, you have not so learned Christ. And then verse 21 says, the truth is in Jesus. If you want to know how you ought to be living, then you just go to the Word of God, and God will tell you how to do that. And verse 24 says that you put on the new man which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness. That's what happens to a person whose mind is right. He or she is still affected sensually. You're still affected sexually. You're still affected by what you see and what you smell and what you touch and what you feel and what you hear. You're still affected by those things. But you don't think about it the same way. That's what he's saying. He's not saying you don't have all of these urges and all of these things that help make life pleasurable. He's not saying that. He says, but now you think about it differently. And if you want to change what you're doing, you better start thinking about it differently. And then look at the passage in chapter 5 that Blake read as we began tonight. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. I love this. I love, because I think it makes such a strong, needed point when it comes to how we act. See then that you walk circumspectly. I know I've preached this lesson. I've preached aspects of this lesson here before. I'm sure of that. I'm sure probably within the first month or two I was here, I preached a lesson similar to this. And it's because I think this lesson is so needed everywhere. This is a lesson which points that I make a lot of times when I go off into meetings because I think it's needed everywhere. And Paul says you need to walk circumspectly, and if you do that, then you're walking as a wise person and not as a foolish person. And I love the adverb there. You need to walk circumspectly. Some translations, your translation may say carefully. A few translations say accurately. But it identifies the way in which you walk. And walking has to do with the way you live your life. And he says you need to pay attention to how you live your life carefully. It's the idea, and I've used the illustration many times of at the circus, you know, those high wire people that walk across the high wire. You don't see them sprinting across. What do? You see them carefully placing one foot in front of the other. I used to demonstrate this. Now I can't hardly do that myself. But you know, they get the it's a bar. Thank you very much. They get a bar and they start walking across there, and they do it very slowly. You know why they do that? Because they don't want to fall. It wouldn't matter how I did it, slowly or fast. I'm going to fall. But people who are qualified to do that, they walk circumspectly. They walk carefully, identifying each step and engaging each step so that they don't fall. And that's what Paul is saying. That's the idea. It's the idea of paying the kind of attention to it that you need to pay. And I'm going to suggest again to us, to those of us who hopefully have learned what the truth is, and we have learned what it does mean to be this new man and to walk this way, what I'm suggesting is we need to be careful about what we do. I know this for a fact. There are some of us who aren't careful about that. I know that for an absolute fact. Because of things that I observe, and because of things that I have seen, and because of things that I have heard. And I've heard them enough to know that there's legitimacy to what we're talking about. So I know that there are people who aren't walking carefully. That's exactly what Paul says you need to do. You need to walk carefully. Because if you don't, you see yourself, then you determine you're walking in a foolish manner because you're not paying attention, the kind of attention that you need to what you do. And so may I just suggest to all of us that we honor this biblical admonition and that we pay very careful attention to what we do, because we need to redeem the time. The days are evil. We need to make sure that what we're saying to people in the world is that we really do want to honor God by the way we live our lives. Go back up in chapter 5 to these first few verses. I want to call your attention to another point. Therefore, he says, be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you as is fitting for saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. For this you know, that no fornicator or unclean person, nor covetous man, or an idolater has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Therefore, do not be partakers with them. When I mention Facebook, I run a risk that some of you are going to go right there right while I'm preaching. I'm going to put you on the honor system. If I find out that you're going to go to this Facebook site when I'm preaching, I'm going to come out there and bang you over the head. I'll just tell you that right now. But this past week, I put a picture of my roommate at Florida College and me. He was also a teammate. I put it on my Facebook page. One of our classmates had sent it to me, and I think she had even posted it on her Facebook page. And we posted it. She posted it because he passed away last week. He died. He was my age. He died of a heart attack in his sleep, evidently. He lived outside of St. Louis, but he was from Tampa. And he was a good friend. I didn't see him but about every other year, and we saw each other briefly, but we were very close, and he passed away. But I tell you that story because I put a picture on my Facebook page of the two of us at a basketball banquet back in 1978, and I was wearing a gray leisure suit. Those of you who know what that is, that's why you're smiling and that's why you're laughing. I'm going to wear it next week just to tell you that I can still get it. Not really not. But I tell you that because I want to tell you a story when I bought that leisure suit. In what would have probably been the spring of it would have been 1978. I guess it would have been the spring of 1978. My mother sent me some money. As I recall, it was $100. Now, $100 in the spring of 1978 was a lot of money. I mean, that's a lot of money. And she said, I want you to buy you a suit. And I said, that'd be great. So I went to a store in the University Mall in Tampa, Florida called Mr. Mann. It was designed, it had clothes for the 18-year-old. And at the time, I happened to be 19. But I went in that store, and I can remember going in that afternoon, there were two young ladies in that store. They were both students at the University of South Florida. 20, 21 years old, a little older than me, a little wiser than me. And they knew exactly what they were doing when I walked in that store, and I was the only customer in that store. They double-teamed me. I met them at the door when I walked in. Sir, may we help you? Well, I'm looking for a suit. Well, what size do you wear? And I remember telling her what size. I'll not tell you what size, but I told her what size it was, and she said, well, I think we may have something. And the truth of the matter, they didn't have anything in that store to fit me. But I wanted to talk to those two girls, so I stayed in the store. And I went to the back, and she says, let me see what I can find. And she perused all through there, and finally she pulled one off the shelf, and she said, I think this one might work for you. And so she said, why don't you try it on? I looked, I said, I'm not sure that's going to work. She said, just try it on. So I did. I went into the dressing room, and I know I didn't jump from the top of the dressing room to get into it, but that would have been the better way for me to get into that suit. That was the tightest suit that I'd ever put on in my life. And I made the mistake of sucking my gut in and buttoning my pants, and I walked out, and both of them together, almost in unison, said, that looks good. And you know what I did? I bought that suit. You know how many times I wore it? Twice. I don't think I spent the full $100, but I spent pretty close to $100 on a suit that I wore twice because two girls that knew exactly what they were doing said, you look good in that suit. But I want to tell you something about that suit. It didn't come close to fitting me. It didn't fit me. Now, did you hear what Paul said in Ephesians 5 and verse 3? He says there are some things that Christians ought to do, but verse 3 says, but fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you. Why? That's not fitting for saints. And then verse 4 says, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. And there's a lot in there, but here's my point. There are some things that simply don't fit Christians. And I'm here to tell you tonight, folks, we know what those things are. Don't we? I believe with all of my heart we know. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's not some learning that needs to be done. I'm not suggesting that there may not be some decisions that need to be made. I've told the story many times about the young lady that I studied with, and she became a Christian, and she was so excited about that. And she said, listen, I want you and Beth to go out with me and my husband, and I want you to help me. I want you to help him, teach him the truth. And I said, I'd be glad to do that. She said, well, let's go out to dinner. I said, we'd be glad to do that. She said, where do you want to go? And I said, it doesn't really matter to me where you want to go. She said, can we meet you at Hooters? And I stopped and I said, no, we can't go there. And I explained to her why we couldn't go there. And after I explained it to her, you know what she said to me? She said, I get it. She just obeyed the gospel. And even just in the short time that I explained to her, my wife and I can't go there, and here's why we can't go there. And as soon as I explained it, she said, makes perfect sense to me. She looked at me, she said, you know, I don't think now I can go there. And I said, exactly. And yet so many of us who have been Christians for so long, we have these big issues about where can I go and what can I do. And I don't think it's that hard, folks. I'm not suggesting that there aren't difficult decisions that we have to make. But the bottom line is, I think that most Christians know that there are things that don't fit Christians. And as I've said hundreds of times, even to this audience, and I know I've said it in Florida many times and wherever else around the country that I've gone to preach because I've talked about this, I will tell you this, the problem is not that we don't know. The problem is what we don't like what we know. That's the problem. And Paul says, listen, there's just some things that just don't fit. And you don't need to be doing those things. And I'm going to say to some of you tonight, there's things that you may be doing that you don't need to be doing because they don't fit. The final thing is found in verse 8, beginning of Ephesians 5. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth, finding out what is acceptable to the Lord, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. Folks, may I just say to you that we live in a world where the lines that are drawn are blurred. For some reason, they're becoming blurred. And people just, again, I think they're blurred because we don't want to see what's obvious. And we need to be people who are not only willing to stand up and say, you know, that's just not something I can do. I can't be involved with that. And when somebody asks why, don't say, well, it's because my mom and dad, if my mom and daddy find out, they're going to get upset. Well, I hope they do get upset, but that's not the reason you ought not be involved in it. The reason you ought not be involved in it because it's not fitting for a Christian to be involved in that kind of thing. And if you will be strong enough to expose those works of darkness and those things that a Christian really does have no business being involved in, you'll be a person who the Lord sees as wise, not unwise. And you'll understand, as verse 17 says, you'll understand what the will of the Lord is. And you'll be the kind of person that will be pleasing to Him. And I hope that's what you want. That's what God wants us to want. And if we'll be honest with ourselves and make some of those decisions based upon what we know that we ought to be doing, I think that the Lord will be pleased. I know He'll be pleased, and we'll be better as a result because we'll be doing what He wants us to do. Well, that's it. If you can take some of that and use it because it's what the Lord said, then that would be great. I'm going to sing an invitation song. And if you have a spiritual need, make it known as we stand and as we sing.